Well, welcome to the Fall 2021 Walton lecture series at the Catholic University of America. It's the first of this academic year. We are very excited to have you, all of you. I welcome the faculty, of course, including our dean, I can see, Mark Ferguson, he's saying hi. All our colleague faculty, maybe most important than all of us, our students. Thank you for being here with us. And many other visitors. I can see, of course, I'll introduce some of them soon. Let me say a few things before I get started, just so we know what's going to happen. I'll give a few issues, talk a little bit about what's going to happen this afternoon. Then I'll introduce the general topic of the lecture series, and then I will introduce our speaker tonight. So first, I want to thank the Walton family, because all this series, including our next week visiting of Trey Tranham, you could see there. Say hi, Trey, please. Is made possible by their generous support. So thank you, the Walton family. Douglas Palladino, who everybody that is in architecture knows, has kindly accepted to be the moderator of today's conversation after the talk. He did such a good job that I hired him again. Thank you, Douglas, for doing this. Please, those of students or faculty or anybody that is interested in asking questions, type them in the chat room, and Douglas will work with that. Those of you that would like to get AIA continuing education credits, you will need to send me your name and your number, and I'll in the chat I will put my email so you know who to send that email to, and I'll take care of recognizing those credits to you. So let me now talk a little bit about today's lecture. And actually, I'd like to talk about the lecture series as a whole, because I feel it's a very special one, at least of all the one I have done in my 10 years. It's very special because all the four speakers are really related with this larger theme of justice in architecture. And this has a lot to do with the Walton Critic 2021, Walton Critic Trey Tranham. He and I worked over the summer, and we thought it would be fantastic. We could have a coherent lecture series that address this matter from as wide as possible. So I think we are up for a treat. And we start tonight with our speaker, which I introduce in a minute. Then we're gonna go with Trey in a week time, and then we're gonna go to John Kett, who's actually tonight speaking in mid-October. And then we're going to go to April De Simone, who will speak in early November. So all this hopefully will make sense as a package. So that will encourage people to attend all the talks. So let me say a couple of things about today's topic. And I will just read this because then it gets in our head a little bit, maybe more clear than I could speak just freely. The best example of architecture are buildings that transcend. By this, we mean structures that go well beyond successfully responding to functional, economic, sustainable, contextual, cultural, or symbolic expectations. Aesthetics is perhaps the most obvious way to attain such goal. In beauty, we may find the ineffable or immeasurable, as great architects and philosophers have pointed out. But there is more to architectural transcendence than aesthetics, a path that many would argue is plagued with pitfalls, leading to irresponsible hedonism, subjectivism, and escapism. Architecture in service of an ethical practice, while more horizontal and immanent than its aesthetic sister, may be such a much wiser choice. After all, the pursuit of the good is the most direct and compassionate way, not only to help others, nature, or the world, but also to reach God. As Texas architect professor Michael Benedict claims in his book, God is a Good We Do. The issues of ethics acquire particular currency in our days, where issues of social, economic, environmental and racial justice have become increasingly visible and therefore unavoidable for us to address. This semester lecture series will focus on the ethical function of architecture, as Yale philosopher Carsten Harris puts it. More specifically, as I said earlier, we will consider justice and in architecture. What does it mean to pursue justice in architecture? How do the various spatial and social cultural dimensions of the built environment contribute to healing, compassion, and equity? Is empathy important? Can architecture foster peacemaking? Where do you stand ethically in front of today's challenges, and what are you going to do about it? How does spirituality enter your architecture practice? We are starting this lecture series with Jane C. Edwards and also Elisabeth Swanson, who along Donna Moore are the leaders of the Jane's Way, which I'm sure we're going to hear more about, three powerful, inspiring women. In her lecture, Soulful Reckonings, Space, Place, Time, and Justice, Jane and Elisabeth will discuss the importance of historical literacy for justice work, arguing that we are indeed in a moment of global reckoning and transformation upon which our collective ability to thrive and even to survive rests. They would point at the relevancy of the built environment in advancing such vision. Let me now quickly say a little bit about Jane and Elisabeth so you get a context, and then I will shut up and you will be able to really enjoy the talk. Jane C. Edmonds is a civil rights icon in the greater Boston area. Founder and CEO of Jane C. Edmonds and Associates, a diversity leadership consultancy launched long before the term diversity was coined. Jane built her consultancy after her tenure as chair of the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. Jane noted how mutually unsatisfying these adjudications were to all parties, even those who won, and she became inspired to work on prevention, changing consciousness in individuals, organizations, and communities as a way to reduce discrimination and all forms of oppression and othering. As part of her life journey, Jane was drawn into public service, working with people across the spectrum of identity and politics and serving in senior leadership roles in both the Michael Dukakis and Mitt Romney gubernatorial administrations. She cultivated academic credentials over many years teaching leadership and change management through DEI principal at Northeastern University and around the world before joining Babson College as vice president of community outreach and programming and launching, of course, Jane's Way. Jane's network are unparalleled around the country and internationally. She's a convener, an empath, and an arbiter. She's a laser focus on impact. In Jane's words, time is now. Let me just quickly now introduce Elisabeth Swanson. She's the Mandel Family Foundation Senior Term Chair and Professor of Literature and Human Rights, Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Author of Beyond Terror, Gender, Narrative, Human Rights. She has also edited 4 volumes and published many articles in the areas of multicultural and international literature, gender studies, and human rights. Dr. Swanson has worked extensively on issues of slavery, past and present, serving as co-chair of the international NGO Historians Against Slavery and as a board chair of the NGO Made by Survivors from 2008 to 2016. She also served as the Barnstable County in Cape Cod Human Rights Commission from 2007 to 2010. Professor Swanson has worked in higher education for 30 years and is the recipient of many awards for scholarship, public service, and teaching, including being voted Professor of the Year 4-time by graduating classes at Babson College and one of the top 50 business school professors by Poise and Quants for 2020. In her consulting work, Dr. Swanson is committed to supporting individuals and organizations in building authentically inclusive communities. Indeed, a new inclusive social contract that reflects the rich diversity of our world. I'm very honored and happy to introduce you, Jane and Elisabeth, to CUA. Please.
Thank you.
All yours.
Thank you so much, Julio, for that lovely, lovely introduction. And I'm just delighted to be here this evening with all of you and to share the stage with my colleagues, my dear friends, and as Dr. Martin Luther King would call them, drum majors for justice. And that's Trahan, John Kett, and April DeSimone, whom you will hear next week and the weeks that follow. I'm also delighted to introduce Donna Ryan Moore, who's a business partner with Jane's Way. So she's here to listen and to participate with all of you. You'll hear more from Elisabeth at the end of my remarks. I'm going to have an opportunity just to talk with you and to share my perspectives about this important topic and look forward to the Q&A. So feel free to jot any questions along the way that you have, either into the chat if you can, or just to hold them to the end. We'd love very much to chat with you. So before I begin and before I get started in earnest, I want to offer you the refrain of my remarks for this evening. And I'd like for you to really hear it and let it roll around in your ears and think about what it might mean for you in different areas of your life. We all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. We all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. We all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. So, okay, hold on to that and just open your eyes and ears and let us recall the days immediately following the murder of Mr. George Floyd. Say his name. And let us also recall the global reckoning that got underway just then. I start with this video so that everyone gathered here to talk about reckoning realizes you were not just hearing from me, you were hearing from voices from people from all over the world. So let's watch this video and then I will return with a few remarks.
Because you have been freed and you freed yourselves. They do not control your mind at all. You are here.
times we say history repeats ourselves, but we're forgetting a lot of history because we weren't taught the history. Something that I know our generation is doing is rewriting history. We're teaching the things that we were not taught. We're pushing the issues that we need to push because we're tired of being sick and tired of fighting for our lives, for fighting for our parents, our siblings, our cousins, our people that are trying to live the same way everybody else is trying to live.
Watching this video now, nearly a year and a half since its scenes took place, I don't have words to express what comes up for me. Mostly I see the longing for a different world that infuses the energy in those streets. I also see new faces, new voices from all walks of life, gathered with one goal, one singular goal, to reckon with our past as we design a different future. And there is much good evidence to suggest that such a reckoning is in fact taking place. One where actions will match statements word for word, and we will finally change. Rather than just lamenting, the structures that shape a world where different kinds of humans are expected, indeed are set up to experience different kinds of lives. The thing is, though, we have been here before. And to be honest, it's very hard for me to see the gains I would have expected when I was standing in front of the Washington Monument all the way back in 1963 for Dr. King's historic "I Have a Dream" speech. I can remember how awestruck I was that so many people from so many walks of life had decided to descend on that place to make their longing for a different world known. And let us take a moment to reflect on the passage of time and the lack of material progress that led to the 9-minute, 29-second public torture and murder of Mr. George Floyd, 57 years later. And I'm here to tell you, the pain, yes, the pain continues. I will return to the issue of time later, but for now, let us take careful note. We see in this video evidence how people hope for a better world. They hope for it. But please know this, if we don't match our actions to our words, we will not succeed in bringing that world into being. And that's why tonight, I ask you to think seriously about your power. Change will come only from an authentic mindset. You have to want it, you have to burn for it, or we'll go another 50 years. And the students of the future may or may not have the opportunity to listen to someone like me talk about what it is to live in the gap between stated equality and lived harm. And I simply refuse to believe that any of us are satisfied with the state of the world now, or that we would want to pass it on as it is to another generation. Be well advised, if it's the first time you are seeing this violence, just know that a lot of people have seen it before, have lived it their entire lives. The level of harm at which so many express surprise is absolutely no surprise to so many of us. And that is what Langston Hughes meant when he wrote, "America never was America to me. So let us think about this America through the rest of this talk. As Isabel Wilkerson reminds us in Caste, America is an old house with a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we call home. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go to the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you're ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction. And whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. You know, I'm certain that Dr. Wilkerson would agree with me when I say to you, ignorance is no protection. Truth is truth, and it will out. How do we face it? With courage, heart, guts, with a transformational mindset. So let us go then. We're here to look in the basement together and to deal with whatever it is we may find. And we are here to remember together we all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. Before we get to the parts of our house that may be in disrepair, let us consider the very structure that works for some. That is, a safe skin with a smooth flow for some is a terrifying, terrifying funhouse for others, where the stairs marked opportunity go nowhere, only to more stairs, more likely descending, often to injustice, exclusion, and even to premature death. Imagine that instead of the designer or builder who can access any space with keys that fit, you are a woman on the run and you're trying to escape a violent someone and you're pushing the door at each landing, and yet finding as you ascend the staircase, the doors are sometimes so locked, so big and so strong, and your terror so great. But this is where authentic allies come in. Those who can open the door, pull you inside, lock it behind you, ensure you are safe, and escort you further up the stairs to the opportunity that awaits you in this free country. Hear the words. Hear the words. I can't breathe. As you look for a way out of the misery and harm you're experiencing and imagine the hope for a better life. That is what we are reckoning with tonight. And let's spend the rest of our time touring our national house, the house of race and racism, the house of, quote, unquote, a multicultural democracy. Where do we need repair? And as we do the hard looking, let us not lose sight of a vision where there are no out people. You know, no need for white allies to open doors for Black and brown people, because designers, builders, and makers like you will have created something different. A great big open source agora of a world where it is unthinkable to build spaces that reflect the ideology of subhumanization on the one hand, while other spaces reflect the full humanity and autonomy of those who live there. Architect April DeSimone will share more on this crucial point when she joins you as part of this lecture series in just a few weeks. Come on in then. Take a look around this American house of ours. In what corner of our basement have we let storm damage fester? And how have the pipes, the walls, the very air of the system carried that damage up from the basement to put pressure on the entire house? Let us reckon with the house we live in as we remind ourselves again and again, we all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. And when we say this, I do not mean to suggest that we are all negligent in not paying attention, but let us forget that some of us live in a town or a city or a country with damage and harm that we cannot even see because we have been spatialized, segregated out of its range. And others of us may be invested in covering signs of mold and rot with a rug or a progress narrative, as the case may be, so as to be able to move onward without struggle or pain, so as to be able to get mine. The hope I bring to you today is that as you begin to train your attention around the dim corners of that damp basement in this moment of historical reckoning, you are going to find, as the hopeful voices and faces we witnessed in the video just now make clear, we are also in a moment of transformation. What the good people at the MIT Presencing Institute, which I highly suggest you visit, call the emergent future. MIT claims the number one most important variable that will ensure the emergent future is transformational literacy. The tools and mindsets that take us collectively from an ego world of division to an eco world of collective action for surviving and thriving. James Way adds that we must also cultivate historical literacy so that we know and can act from the truth of our shared past, building a more just and equitable future by not denying past harm. What does it mean to be historically literate? It means getting fluent in the language and themes of our history, its patterns and repetitions, understanding that we labor under a dual narrative. On the one hand, a racial progress narrative that most of us learned in school, and on the other, and unbeknownst to many in this country, a very different one, grounded in the lived experience of Black people along the full continuum of oppression and violence. This slide captures one of the key takeaways of this talk, the illusion of a racial progress narrative that started with slavery and concluded in 2008 with the first Black presidency. That narrative looks linear, straight, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, like the image on the left. But what about the experience of Black people? Can we plot that experience on a line from slavery to freedom and equality? We cannot. Not when the violence, oppression, and inequity that started in the time of enslavement continues into the present time. Instead, US history from the perspective of Black citizens looks more like a spiral, what poet Amiri Baraka called the changing same, a circular repetition of the most traumatic elements of this racist society, as illustrated in the descending spiral staircase to the right. But let us turn to the progress narrative for a moment, for surely there has been progress from slavery to emancipation, from emancipation to that 100-year blip we gloss in the history books, a long period known as the Jim Crow era that spanned from the end of the Civil War in 1865 through the 1960s civil rights movement, marked by the onslaught of state and local laws that nullified federal emancipation laws by legalizing racial segregation, stripping Black people of their voting rights, controlling where they lived, traveled, and worked, and criminalizing them to exploit their labor. At James Way, we understand the Jim Crow era in both northern and southern regions of the United States to be the key to dispelling the progress narrative, which typically skips directly to that period after the civil rights movement when we moved into the light of new legislation and achieved that pinnacle, a Black family in the White House, triumph, no more racism, post-racial society. And this triumph is plotted out like our favorite kind of story, where the good guys win and we all sigh with relief. But I'm here to ask you, what if the progress narrative exists at the same time that history keeps spinning on the same axis, just more covertly now? What if racism was excised from the law of the land, but retained as the deeply embedded culture, reproduced generation by generation, town by town? How else do we explain the persistence of disparities, of the terror endured by Black people? What you see here is a depiction of that changing saying, a traumatic history that keeps repeating so that the unknown enslaved man killed for some infraction against the slaveholder becomes a figure of the unknown lynched man or woman, becomes Emmett Till, becomes Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Say their names. Trauma, history, repetition, denial, the changing saying. And unfortunately, this is a problem with our national narrative about race and racism. Not just that we adhere to a progress narrative that's only partly true, but that progress narrative covers over and denies the truth of the racism's repetitive nature, adding the injury of denial to the experience of Black people who have endured and who are now enduring it. Which brings us right back to our refrain. We all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. The national, even global affliction of denial of the truth of racism and its harm is what we dispel when we insist upon reckoning with the past. We insist upon it, as we've done here tonight. This reckoning, in turn, is the foundation of our collectively designed transformation. At Jamesway, we use the metaphor of the circuit board to conjure up both complex systems and networks of harm, as well as those of healing and possibility. The image came to us from Elisabeth, who one day found herself walking in Shani Chowk, the old section of India's capital city, Delhi. Underneath a labyrinth tangle of electric cords running here, there, and everywhere else, impossible to track who had spliced who else's supply of electricity to redirect it to their own room or space. And it struck her that this wild tangle, outside of the bounds of law and governance, was like slavery itself, an impossibly complex system of domination and control that is extremely difficult to track and control. And it occurred to her that the anti-trafficking movement must build itself in just as complex and determined a way in order to prevent, intervene in, and create alternatives to slavery and exploitation. The same is true for anti-racist work. Racism is the out of control circuit board of harm, firing off signals in all directions, doing its damage. We then must become the anti-racist circuit board of possibility, of connection, of the richness of the full human potential. And we must work every bit as hard to prevent, intervene in, and create alternatives to racist harm. And that's what we call authentic allyship. As Ibram Kendi reminds us, it's not enough to be not to be racist. We must all maintain an actively anti-racist stance in all of our dealings, each and every day. It's a consciousness to cultivate, a discipline to practice, a way of being in each and every interaction. And it leads to greater awareness that systems are fluid, not fixed as they appear. They can change. They must change. You must design outside the bounds of what just is. As Amanda Gorman so powerfully exhorted us in her inaugural poem earlier this year, because what just is not yet, not by a long shot, justice. As thinkers, designers, builders, makers, you must come from the fire in your belly that burns for transformation and hope. You must come from the mindset, heart set, gut set of true justice that you have actively cultivated. You cannot simply limit your thinking to the status quo of what is, because what is right now in built environments is unjust and harmful to human potential. In some ways, this boils down to your ability to vision beyond what is required or allowed by regulatory regimes or the law. Because as you well know, the law itself can easily support injustice as it can ever provide justice. The law has allowed for episodic wins, like Brown v. Board of Education, but do you remember what it took to convert that law into naturally occurring culture? Oh, right. It took the National Guard in Little Rock, Arkansas. It took busing in Boston. And do you know it is still not a naturally occurring phenomenon? We have never solved the segregation for the link between schooling and neighborhood, the role that the built environment has played in disallowing the law of integration to be carried out to the letter. We all live inside the house of what we pay attention to. It's not that I'm just dismissing the power of the law. After all, if Brown v. Board didn't happen, where would we be? But I do ask myself all the time why we rely on governmental entities to do the work that we as individual humans could do ourselves. If we cared about others, if we could see all humans as humans. And if we can't see all humans as humans, why? Do we ask that question? If we can't see them in the fullness of their dignity, then that's the question we must ask ourselves. We can look at laws that have been made for justice, but if we want those directives to be real, we are depending on human beings to make them work. So I keep coming back to our power, our personal power as individuals, to have the transformational consciousness to do this work. Let's think about the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Why did it take this legal act for planners, designers, and builders to consider people with disabilities? If I'm a designer making a building and I have not accounted for access for all people, then I ask myself why. Is it because I just have not thought about it? And if it is because I haven't thought about it, then why? When the truth is that even a member of our own family may be impacted by lack of access, let alone all the nameless others whose possibilities for both pain and joy you are designing for. This society could be grander, better, more humane, if we try to use our moral imaginations and all the sources of our personal power when designing for others. It was, in fact, my experience as the head of the Massachusetts State Civil Rights Agency, the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, that made me question the law in relation to issues of inclusion and belonging. When I arrived, there was a backlog of 4,800 cases, which is why we became the first full-time leadership of that commission. There were many plaintiffs who didn't have their cases heard for 8 or 9 years. We were trying to move and activate that case law, but the truth is that the state system was not funded to handle so many cases, so many people just languished. Even cases that got heard. However, all I can say is there were no winners in that system. No matter which way the case went, it was very rare that anyone felt satisfied. The people before us often felt stripped of their dignity, their sense of opportunity, and enjoyment of all this free society offers as a result of the discriminatory acts of the person or organization they were charging. And our remedies could not ever make that right. On the other side, you could see the organization expending their energy and resources fighting the claim of an individual, a hurt soul. You had to wonder if it ever made sense for them to fight this case. Couldn't they channel those dollars, that energy to settle those cases before they got to this level? Since so many cases were about managers not being able to see other humans as humans, there was no real victory that came out of such proceedings. And I learned that rather than utilizing the law as a tool of inclusion, the focus should be on how to create the kind of environments that prevent such situations from arising in the first place. I'm not naive. I understood then and now that sometimes there was just terrible behavior, Ku Klux Klan-like thoughts and behaviors. But most of those cases were not like that. I learned that if you can touch people, if you can elevate their relations, then you could transform the daily lives of so many people. I went to some companies that had many cases at the MCAD, and I asked you, would you be willing instead to let me work with a few of your managers to find out together what we could do to minimize the number of cases at the Mass Commission Against Discrimination? And they gave me a year. And that is how my first diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy, James C. Edmonds and Associates Incorporated, was born. Before, diversity, equity, and inclusion were buzzwords that everyone uses. The fact that I'm still at it 30 years later is evidence, unfortunately, of that changing saying I was describing above. And so I leave you with these thoughts. Let us close the gap between the time that we pronounce justice in our laws and other statements and when we make the material changes that make justice actually happen. In other words, let the time of when something must be done coincide with the doing of it. Let our future generations enjoy justice and never have to take to the streets to demand it. You well-intentioned future designers, builders, and makers, stay vigilant about the gap between your intentions and the impacts you have. Consider all the people when designing. Keep access and aesthetics and accommodation equally in mind. Remain always mindful that we live inside the house of what we pay attention to. That gives you more power, more agency than you ever know to make that transformational change. It is the only way that we will survive. Reverse the habit of plunder that is so powerfully demonstrated in our public and private spaces. Unleash the forces of equity, of rebalancing, of healing the very worst crime there is, the soul murder of individuals and of groups across time and space. Think of the moral importance of this work. As we reckon together, ask yourself, what kind of legacy do you want? How do you want to be remembered? If you look back 20 years from now, what will you be able to see of your own contributions to equity and justice? Thank you.
Beautiful talk, Jane, beautiful talk.
We would love to open it for questions.
Douglas, you run this, please.
Well, I think fortunately our chat was not turned on, and I say that's fortunate because I think it's really much better to hear the questions directly from the mouths of those that have questions. I just want to say I think it was a really powerful presentation, and I kept coming out of a room seconds ago talking to students who are designing the new state house for the Douglas Commonwealth when the DC becomes a state. I kept hearing in your presentation echoes of what my students are saying. I mean, this notion of we live in the house that we pay attention to, you know, and that we not be satisfied with the world as it is, but what we want to pass on to future generations. That's what architects do, right? That's all we do is look at, and ignoring problems never make them better. And it's the problems that we ignore and the unintended consequences of our actions that are our greatest regrets. And so I think in your discussion of broad societal issues, I hear immediate architectural implications. And, you know, and the ADA is a perfect example of that. I mean, we're all disabled at some point, whether you're the lacrosse guy who blew out his knee or somebody who's lucky enough to live old enough to be disabled, that we have to think of, and I really want to hear from the students, but I mean, my brain was spinning when you talked about this. I always ask myself, who is your client?
Wonderful question.
Is it the guy who signed the contract, who borrowed the money to develop the site? who won't even own it for 20 years or 10 years or 5 years, never lived there himself. Who is your client? Who are you greatest responsibility to? I mean, the law says we're responsible for the health, safety, and welfare. But that last one of welfare, as architects, is the hardest one to kind of quantify.
Yeah, it is. Oh, Douglas, your remarks are so touching that you're bringing tears to my eyes. You know, your questions are great questions. I'd love to create as much of an opportunity for us to talk, and Elizabeth jump in, and for that matter, I invite Donna to jump in as well, because she's here and we all have different perspectives. But you know, I've been in business for a long time, as you heard in my remarks. With this is the second business enterprise, and whenever I think of my client, I obviously owe it to my client to give the best that I have to give, and to push that client to be the best that I believe that client is capable of becoming. And it's not always easy. It's not always easy, let me tell you. But I never lose sight of my core values and what I believe is important for this world, because frankly, the work is not enough to satisfy me personally. But what is important is whether or not I can answer the question at the end of the day: what have I done to make the world better? And how have I tried to help my client see what I see, recognizing that my client ultimately has the final decision point, the authority. But I push my clients, you know, I push them hard, unapologetically, because that's who I am. And if they find it too tough to take, then I won't continue, you know. But I don't lose sight of that. And I think that's where we need to be. I think, especially when I look at all of you on the screen, I mean, you're the hope. You're my hope for a better world. And it's not just race. There are all these things in the world that we could think about. But I do think, thinking about the house that we live in, this is my house of America. You know, I sing America, God bless America, with great pride too. But as I sing it, I recognize that as a Black woman, that this America is a flawed house. And it will change with our imagination and determination and innovation and conviction that we need to work on this daily as a mindset. And so, you know, that's what we're here for. And as I look at all of you, I would love to invite you to be Janes, as we say it, Jane's way. You know, we always joke about it a bit, but what we mean by that is, if you sign on to anything that we've said, then we kind of dub you as a Jane, you know, because we really think that's where we need to be. But go ahead.
We have a question from some people in the audience. So as you would like to speak, just raise your hand and you'll move to the top of my screen and I'll call on your name.
Yeah, what's on your mind? Yeah.
Mo, please, you go first.
I think Robin had her hand up before me,
But you're the student, so you go.
okay. Your thoughts about attention reminded me of Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy work, where she argues that we grow where our attention is placed, and for the intentionality of attentiveness and perceptiveness. So I'm wondering how we can, or whether we should curate the things we intake and accept in order to grow in intentional and deliberate, or whether that will lead to a further warped sense of reality.
And am I reading you, Donna? It looks like you're bursting to speak.
You're muted, Donna. You have to unmute.
No, we talk about that often, Mo, as far as like when you said we grow where our attention is placed, it's almost like the attention and the intention, you know, as far as what it is that we're looking to activate. There are so many times that I think that this work aligns so much with, you know, when you talk about mindfulness and what we place our attention on. So that was why Jane saw me smiling. That resonated with me.
Robin?
Yes, thank you. Jane, thank you so much for that talk. It was wonderful. Really appreciate it. I'm a teacher here, and I have all 14 of my students here attending this evening because what we're doing in our studio really resonates with what you're talking about. And I had a specific question for you that I hope that you can help steer our studio a little bit. We're doing a net zero carbon studio. So we're focused on adaptive reuse, and our site is in Shaw in DC. And we're focusing very heavily on community outreach because, you know, you were saying you push your client. Conversely, in our studio, we're being pushed by our client. We want to listen, we want to learn. And I'm wondering if you can point our students to excellent, outstanding precedents of adaptive reuse in urban neighborhoods that you think that the architects have been a successful listener, not imposing their will, but listening. If you have any thoughts on that, anyone, I would love to hear
it. The short answer is yes, we'd be happy to help specifically on your question. And maybe there's a way that we can get some information after this to Julio to make available to you that would be specifically on point. But I would also, I see Elisabeth Sanders raised.
Oh.
Probably wants to comment. Go ahead.
Well, actually, on the question of adaptive reuse, I mean, I think that's such a powerful question. I want to defer to all the architectural folks because I don't have, examples myself off the top of my head, but I think, but what you're talking about just excites me that you've got all your students here doing that thing. I actually had my hand up because I just wanted to respond to Mo to the part of your question about, does this mean that we should curate what we take in, and if we do that, then are we warping our perception? And so I think the fact that you're thinking about it is the key, because you want to, I believe, curate enough so that you can manage, literally manage to sort of stay sane in the onslaught, but not so much that you miss the range of perspectives and even seek out those ones that might differ from your own kind of for that reason. But I think when we were talking about attention and intention, it was less about putting, allowing our attention to be broad or tight, but more about reducing the gap, I think, between what we say and what we do. So we say words, like we say peace, but if you were to quantify somehow peace efforts versus war efforts globally, I mean, so it's like that. So I think that's where we're saying, the attention and then the intention, that first we choose to look, and then secondly, we then choose to act, and we try to make the words and action match up. So for what that's worth, but I'd love to hear others on adaptive reuse, because that's
Yeah.
I have a question,
Okay.
and I can't raise my hand for some reason. So I'm just sorry for jumping in. There is this whole dimension of the conversation that sometimes, from some perspective, look, this kind of politically correct, is what everybody's talking about, and that resist some of the discussion that we are having today, because we often, I can speak for myself, I often feel guilty on some level, right, for just being, right, for somehow, even not at a national, I mean, I'm a citizen, but I was not born in this country, but I still feel somewhat guilty, and it's uncomfortable to hear some of these things, to be absolutely honest with you. And I think yet I feel the responsibility of engaging at the level that I'm trying. And what I find very powerful at what you talk, and you put me to almost to tears, is how real you are, and how honest and how sincere you are, and how truly walk the path of you loving rather than you be critiquing and showing other people they're guilty, right? That we are on this together, whatever color we have, whatever sound or accent we have. And I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you too. You we could go on and have so many wonderful conversations. But when you even spoke about politically correct, that's a buzzword that has been very hurtful to me and many people in our experience. I can think about my dad, a product of a segregated South, and he was an achiever, but he also was living in the gap, you know, between having some measure of privilege, but also having some very difficult experiences as a Black man. And he shared with me once that how hurtful it was that his own name wouldn't be used by different people where he grew up in a segregated South. And when he was addressed, he was always referred to as boy, even when he was a man. And I can remember thinking about that later and thinking that somebody might say, well, this is an exercise of politically correct, you know, much like as a female, I can remember the whole controversy when we wanted to be, many of us referred to as a woman rather than as a girl. And, you know, the same kind of thing. And they'd say, oh, it's just political correctness, as opposed to just saying, can we talk about it? Can we have a conversation about why boy is possibly hurtful to you, or why it is that you don't prefer a girl and would like woman? Sometimes we create these barriers by calling something politically correct, and we force these divisions where we can't talk as human beings. And I really think that's a problem for all of us, to, when we hear something that, if our first reaction is to shut it down, to instead just say, can I try to understand more about that? And maybe if we did, we have a chance to see humans as humans.
Yeah.
And not just, you know, trivialize the pain that some people experience. And there's, so I could go on, but, you know, when George Floyd was murdered last year, it is true, I have formidable networks that I've developed at this age and stage, perhaps I should. And I was hearing from people all over the world, as if I was the sort of an authority to, well, how are you feeling? What should we do? And I'd often say, you know, just make sure that you're, that doing nothing is not an option. You know, if you're not really thinking each day what you've done to advance the society and to try to secure justice, you've lost the day.
I kind of think, Julio, that's the balance to, you said that this situation that we're all in can make someone bearing a white skin feel guilty just for being, right? So it's an existential guilt for being part of a system of dominance that we might personally reject, but we're also deeply, deeply immersed in. And so I think that the action is what allows me as a white person in a skin mark perpetrator globally, in some ways, it allows me to move and to act, to feel that whatever integrity I can claim from my historical heritage, I'm trying to do on a daily basis. And it doesn't mean, you know, for all the students in the house, it doesn't mean that this is what you think about 24/7. I'm doing that because I fell in love with literature that brought me on a journey that then taught me, and that's how I chose to direct myself. But whatever it is that you're doing, this is just always that piece where you know, from an early start right now, and I think you probably get it. I know I'm a college professor, my students do. They understand the precarity of the horizon we're looking at right now. And I think they understand the connection here. And so it's just like, get moving and, you know, guilt schmilt in a way, like we gotta go. So that's, yeah.
Victoria has her hand up. Victoria, do you have a question or a comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, I do have a question. I'm in Robin's studio, and on Friday we had a site visit to our site in Shaw, and we also did some community outreach. So part of the community outreach, the information we received was that some people in the community wanted the homeless situation addressed in the community, but we know that a lot of people who face homelessness, like they don't want to be helped, or they don't want to like use the resources that are already being provided, because we know that there is a homeless shelter kind of close to the site already. So kind of on the lines of your saying about intent versus impact and like listening to your client, how do you address a situation like that where certain people want a situation to be addressed, but the people who actually are being affected by it, they don't necessarily want the help.
Mhm.
Can I take that, Jane?
Yes, please. I can see you busting for it. Go.
I'm sorry, it's such a wonderful, thank you, Victoria, it's such a wonderful question. And I think that I'm not sure if anyone has done this, but it's kind of, when you approach a site, it just doing a kind of site survey that would include the folks, right? So doing some kind of interviewing, listening, and what we would call it in formal terms is a needs assessment. But the idea is, what do they need? Why are they rejecting these services? Is it simply that they do not want to be housed? They are having an outdoor experience? Is it that they are finding that the services that are offered might not be up to par, might even be harmful, as the stories abound? And so what is it? I think that's the crux. So do you know if anyone's had conversations with them about the why?
Yeah, there were certain conversations. I think a few people wanted to go to like a different shelter rather than the one that was nearby. And I've heard, at least from like research, that sometimes homeless shelters are actually like dangerous places to be. Yeah.
See that.
So I think that your line of questioning that is about a site, right, and trying to solve a problem around that is both a social and a physical site specific problem, is taking you deeper into the sense of what is it that, I think that's where you're going to find the answer to what you can't force people, right? You can't, there's no way to just, it's really interesting. I'll just share with you really quickly that when I served on the Human Rights Commission here on Cape Cod, the beautiful Cape Cod, that people would say, you have a Human Rights Commission on Cape Cod, it's so beautiful there. That was what I would hear all the time, right? So again, about what we see and don't see. But here on the Cape, a case was brought to us that was the Chamber of Commerce of one of the towns, one of the central towns, where a lot of services for people without homes and for people who are experiencing addiction happened. They wanted to just take all those people and bus them out to other cities and give them a certain little bit of cash, like $50. And it was a stunning sort of proposal. And we were trying to talk to them about cleansing an area, and like, you just simply cannot displace people, annihilate people. So it means, I think, a deeper listening process. And then probably it's going to take someone to that shelter to be, what's going on here? What would make it more attractive? Seems to me. I don't know other folks, but yeah, I think it's an incredible experience you're having in your studio. We'd love to like hear the outcome if ever we could. I see Lisette.
Douglas, are you talking?
Yes, thank you. Lizette, do you have my squeaky chair? I had muted myself. Lizette, do you have a question you'd like to ask her statement?
Yes, I really did enjoy Miss Jane's view. I really agree with her. I did have one concern I wanted to tell you. I can't really stay for the Zoom all the way because I have a class in 15 minutes. Yeah.
You're breaking up, Lizette.
I was saying that I can't stay for the whole Zoom because I have a class in 15 minutes.
Okay, well, that's fine. A question comes from, first I want to say, one of the great things about architecture is that the path is so full. It encompasses all these issues. But I have a question for you, Jane. And one of the things as architects we struggle with is cities, as we know, are living organisms. And like any living thing, plant, it's constantly in the process of dying and being reborn and growing. But as architects, we're often in the process of, when you build, you are displacing. The act of creating is always destroying.
Yeah.
You're destroying the existing condition of that people have adjusted to. And so that I just wonder if you could say a few words to us about gentrification and how architects deal with this issue.
You're spot on, because again, my own experience, when I ran my first business, for those of you who have been in Boston, you're familiar with Copley Place, which is one of our highly touted upscale malls. But I vividly remember when that place was being built, and one of my friends, a civil rights activist, Mel King, who's now in his 90s, rose up and took on the architectural firms that were involved and the landlord and the city of Boston, and had something called Tent City, where Black people camped out and just laid their bodies down and said, no, you can't go through this whole process of gentrification as you speak, and so on. And what I kind of learned there is, looking back, is that until Tent City happened, there was no real discussion about what the possibilities could be as this place was going to be transformed. And it was very difficult to have those conversations in a contentious atmosphere, as you can appreciate, because there was a lot of pushback and a lot of anger that had developed at all different levels. And I found myself, once again, I may sound a bit naive on this, it's unfortunate that on the front end, there wasn't some involvement talking with people who are in this line of work maybe, or who are part of the community, to try to get some insights as they're approaching this great transformation, because just maybe there would have been some opportunity to think about how that place could have evolved in a way that would be even grander than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was a missed opportunity, and I could share more details about the particulars of that case study in my mind. A lot of wasted energy. It eventually did result in a few minority-owned businesses getting space as a trade-off to try to get the Tent City people out of there, and getting a few homes that would be made available for lower economic people in the area. But my own view is it was not as imaginative or as solid a solution as it could have been had there been some talk on the front end. So I think there were missed opportunities like that. Let's have the hard truths, hard conversations on the front end of something. What does your own network look like? How diverse is it? I mean, for some of us, we have a very monolithic kind of network. When we start to say who your friends are, who your family members are, what age group do you hang out with? So, had the designers heard more from the community or people who care about equity, justice, and the like in the front end, I think it would have been a better result.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't lost the idea about active use. I think the Janes just want to say to the person who raised it, we'll try to see if we can put together our heads and figure out how we can send something to Julio on that. So,
Callie, I see your hand. We'll give you the last question, and then unfortunately we'll let Julio make the final remarks, and then we'll have to cut it off. Callie.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I just wanted to go back to a conversation that was happening a few questions ago. I'm from Cape Cod myself, and so I went to high school in Hyannis, Massachusetts.
Cool.
And so I know a lot about, the situation that you're talking about. And one of the things that I found interesting is, how would you take these practices? What are some of the differences between working in an urban environment versus working in a more, I don't want to call Cape Cod rural, but in the sense of what are the major differences that you see in the application of these practices?
And can you just say which practices exactly are you referring to?
I was going to ask the same.
Oh, sorry about that. I meant the management where you would, the whole aspect of listening to your client. Does it differ on scales when you're in a city versus when you're in a smaller town?
I got you. Great question. Nope. I think the principle remains the same. And then what you try to do, this is getting into kind of statistics area where you try to get a representative sample. And so you figure out what the demographic of the population is that you're working with, and try to get people who represent that. Like, one of the things I was thinking about the homeless site, or the site where the first question that came up about this, that the folks don't want to go to that site that exists. I immediately started thinking about just moms, children, you know, it might be something about that. Or so I'd want to, if I was doing the survey, I'd want to talk to all different kind of folks, like mothers and fathers and kids, and then single people and backgrounds, status around addiction, all those things. So I think on those larger scales, it's also about partnering with the agencies who can get you access.
Right.
It's an interesting conversation about whether, you know, how do you access people who are the actual end user of the entity you're designing. You might have to rely on some go-betweens, and that may also impact your sample. But the basic fundamental principles of engaging, as Jane says, on the front end with folks who are impacted, and going a layer deeper, not, you know, because I think you could stop there and say, well, those people don't want the good thing we're offering them, and that's a reading, right? And I'm certain that reading exists. A more humane, a way in which we might see all humans as humans, you might ask them. And then if it's a terrible reason, okay, you push forward. If it's a good reason, hope maybe you can fix it. It gets down to, you know, really engaging with humans.
Yeah, it's not that every problem is solvable necessarily, but
Yeah.
the failure to try to engage, I think, on the front end is a big missed opportunity for everyone concerned, just for the whole creative process. I'm certainly happy for us to entertain any other questions, but I just have to say, since I see that he's on this call, if it had not been for Trahan and his generosity in inviting us, the Janes, to be here this evening, I consider him an ally to help advance what we think is so important. So it's an example of authentic allyship. Thank you, Trey.
And thank you, Jane, for bringing our attention to problems maybe we don't see. Julio, can you please?
Before I thank, because I couldn't write my email. Those of you that want to get AIA credits, just find my name in the school, website and just send me an email, okay? Well, thank you, Douglas, for running this moderated part, and thanks so much, Trey, because I mean, without you, all this wouldn't happen. So you're affected, even just before coming here, you are really affecting all of us. So thank you. And of course, thank Jane and Elisabeth and Donna. I mean, your sincerity, your truth speaking from life experiences, your honesty, directness, the emotional intelligence, how to deal with the nuance and the complexity, and yet be true to yourself. I mean, it's inspiring, and all of you, and thank you. And it's so beautiful to see, and so inspiring, I think, for especially our young women, to see you three really in your own ways making an impact in the world. And I never forget that half of humanity is female, right? And I think it's so good to see you guys lead by example, by great work. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you in a week. In reality, we're going to meet here on campus with Trey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
everyone, so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.